She worked in a quiet corner of a busy city cafe where the sound of cups, plates, and soft conversations filled the air from morning till night. Every day started before sunrise and ended long after the streets outside had gone dark. Her uniform was simple, her movements were quick, and her expression was always calm. Most people who came into the cafe saw her only as a waitress who took orders and cleaned tables. They never looked at her twice. She had learned to live like that, unnoticed, almost invisible, as if she was part of the background. But there was something inside her that no one in that cafe knew about. Long before she started working there, she had once been close to something beautiful. Music had been a part of her life in a way that was hard to explain. She used to listen carefully to every sound around her, noticing rhythms in ordinary things like rain tapping on windows or footsteps on empty streets. At one point in her life, she had even sat in front of a piano and felt something deep and powerful move through her fingers. But life had not been kind or gentle. Responsibilities had grown, opportunities had faded, and slowly she had stepped away from that world. The piano became a memory she carried quietly, locked away inside her. Even though she no longer played, that connection to music never truly left her. Sometimes, when the cafe was empty late at night, she would pause for a moment while wiping a table and let her fingers move slightly in the air, as if remembering invisible keys. She never spoke about it. In fact, she spoke very little at all. Felt safer that way. The world expected her to serve, not to shine. One afternoon, the cafe became unusually crowded. The atmosphere shifted the moment a group entered. They were dressed in expensive clothes, moving with confidence that made others step aside without even realizing it. Among them was a person whose presence seemed to fill the entire space. There was a sense of authority in the way they looked around, as if everything here existed for their entertainment. The staff immediately became more alert, trying to anticipate every need before it was spoken. A large table was prepared near the center, where the lighting was the brightest. Conversations at nearby tables grew quieter as people began to notice the unusual energy. The waitress continued her work, moving from table to table, refilling glasses and taking orders as she always did. She kept her head slightly lowered, focusing on her tasks, hoping to avoid any attention. But attention has a way of finding those who least want it. At one point, the group began discussing entertainment. Their voices were relaxed, but there was a sharpness underneath, like people used to getting whatever they wanted. The piano placed in the corner of the cafe suddenly became a topic of interest. It was not used often, more for decoration than performance. Dust had almost settled on its surface, though it still held a quiet dignity in the room. Eyes turned toward it, and then slowly, those eyes shifted toward the waitress. At first, it was only a suggestion made in passing, something that sounded like a casual idea. But it quickly changed tone. The idea became a request, and the request became an expectation. The atmosphere around the table shifted, as if a decision had already been made without her consent. She felt it before she even heard the words directed at her. The weight of being watched, evaluated, and judged all at once. When she finally looked up, she saw expressions that were not kind. There was curiosity, but also amusement, as if she were part of a private joke she had not been told about. She was asked to play the piano. The request was not gentle. It carried an edge, a challenge hidden inside it. It was clear that refusal was not what they expected. Some of the staff nearby paused, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The room felt smaller than before, the air heavier. For a moment, she said nothing. Her mind moved quickly, not with fear, but with memories she had buried long ago. She remembered sitting in silence near a piano she once knew well. She remembered the feeling of music flowing through her like something natural and effortless. She also remembered why she had stopped. Life had taken that part of her and placed it somewhere out of reach. Now, that same part of her was being pulled back into the light in the most unexpected way. The request was repeated, this time with a faint tone of mockery. It was not just about music anymore. It was about watching someone struggle, about turning a simple moment into entertainment for those who believed they held power in the room. She looked toward the piano. It stood quietly in the corner, untouched, almost forgotten. Then she looked back at the table. Every eye was on her now, waiting, expecting, judging. There was a pause that seemed to stretch longer than it actually was. Then, without a word, she placed the tray she was holding carefully down. Her movements were steady, not rushed. She adjusted her uniform slightly, as if preparing herself for something that had nothing to do with serving tables anymore. She walked. Each step toward the piano felt different from anything she had done that day. The sounds of the cafe faded slightly in her mind. The conversations blurred. Even the laughter at the table behind her seemed distant. She could feel her heartbeat, steady but strong, as if reminding her that something important was about to happen. When she reached the piano, she paused for just a moment. Her fingers hovered above the keys. The surface was slightly cold, unfamiliar at first touch. It had been a long time, too long. Behind her, the room waited. Some people leaned forward slightly, expecting hesitation, maybe even failure. Others simply watched, curious about what would happen next. The group at the center of the cafe seemed confident, almost entertained already, as if the outcome was obvious. She sat down. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Silence filled the space completely. Even the usual cafe noises seemed to fade. It was as if the entire room had been pulled into the same moment. Then, slowly, she pressed the first key. The sound was soft, uncertain at first, but it carried something with it. Not just a note, but a feeling. Another key followed. Then another. Her posture changed slightly, her shoulders relaxing as if something inside her had finally been unlocked. The music began to grow. At first, it was gentle, almost fragile. But it started to change. Patterns formed. Rhythm developed. Emotion began to rise through each note. What had started as a simple attempt quickly transformed into something deeper, something that filled the entire room. People stopped talking. Even those who had not been paying attention turned their heads. Her hands moved with increasing confidence, as if they remembered everything she had once forgotten. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It became a voice, and through it, something powerful was being expressed. The atmosphere in the cafe shifted completely. The earlier tension turned into silence filled with awe. Conversations disappeared entirely. Even the most distracted customers were now fully focused on her. What they had expected was not this. It was not hesitation. It was not failure. It was not something to laugh at. It was something far beyond that. And as the music continued to rise and fill every corner of the room, even those who had intended to mock her found themselves unable to look away. The first notes had already changed something in the room, but no one fully understood what was happening yet. At the table near the center, the group that had made the request sat still, watching with growing confusion. They had expected hesitation, maybe even embarrassment, something they could laugh about quietly among themselves. Instead, what they were hearing made it difficult for them to even speak. The piano sound was no longer soft or uncertain. It had begun to flow with a kind of natural rhythm that filled every corner of the cafe. People who had been eating, talking, or scrolling through their phones were now completely still. Even the staff members stopped moving for a moment, trays held in midair, eyes turned toward the corner of the room. She continued playing without looking up. Her focus was complete, as if the outside world no longer existed. Her fingers moved with growing confidence, pressing each key with a sense of familiarity that surprised even her. It was as though her hands were remembering something her mind had tried to forget. The group that had asked her to play started to shift uncomfortably in their seats. One of them leaned slightly forward, trying to understand what they were hearing. Another gave a small laugh, but it sounded uncertain, not as strong as before. The mood they had carried into the cafe was beginning to break apart. But none of that reached her. For her, the piano was not a stage anymore. It was something personal, something that had been locked away inside her for years. Every note felt like it was pulling pieces of memory back into place. She could almost feel time moving differently, slower and deeper, as if the world had paused just for this moment. At the edge of the cafe, a few customers quietly put down their cups. Some turned their chairs slightly to get a better view. Others simply stood without realizing it, drawn by the sound. There was something in the music that made it impossible to ignore. The group at the center tried to recover their earlier attitude. One of them whispered something, attempting to make a joke, but the words did not carry the same confidence anymore. Another leaned back, crossing their arms, as if trying to hide their discomfort behind an expression of indifference. But their eyes kept returning to the piano. The waitress, still seated, continued playing with steady control. Her posture had changed now. She no longer looked like someone doing something unusual under pressure. Instead, she looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. The music shifted again. It grew deeper, more layered, like a conversation without words. There were moments of softness that made the room feel calm, followed by stronger waves that filled the space with emotion. It was not just technical skill. It felt like something lived, something experienced. A few people in the cafe exchanged quiet looks. They did not know her story, but they could feel that this was not something ordinary. It was not something learned overnight or performed casually. There was meaning in every movement of her hands. At the center table, one of the guests finally looked away from the piano, as if trying to regain control of the situation. But even then, the sound followed them. It was impossible to escape. The cafe, once full of background noise and casual energy, now existed entirely within the music. She continued without stopping. Inside her, something was changing. She had not expected this feeling. She had thought that part of her life was gone forever. But now, as her fingers moved across the keys, she realized that nothing had truly disappeared. It had only been hidden. Her breathing remained steady. Her focus deepened. The piano responded to her touch as if it had been waiting for this moment as well. The sound became richer, filling the space with something almost emotional enough to be seen, not just heard. The cafe manager, standing near the counter, watched quietly. There was concern at first, unsure of what was happening, but that concern slowly turned into surprise. Even the staff who had been rushing around earlier were now still listening. The group that had started this moment began to lose their earlier confidence completely. The leader of the group, the one who had first made the request, leaned back slightly, his expression changing. It was no longer amusement. It was something closer to disbelief. He had not expected this. He had seen many performances before, heard skilled musicians in expensive places, but this was different. There was no stage, no preparation, no expectation. It was happening in a simple cafe, from someone he had assumed would fail. And that assumption was breaking in front of him. The music rose again, reaching a point where it felt like it was carrying the entire room with it. Some customers closed their eyes without realizing it. Others placed a hand on the table, as if grounding themselves. It was not just entertainment anymore. It had become an experience that pulled everyone into it. She did not notice their reactions. She was too deep inside the rhythm now. Every part of her seemed focused on the sound. Her hands moved with precision, but also with emotion. It was not about showing skill. It was about expression. At one point, the music softened again, almost like a pause in a conversation. The room seemed to breathe along with it. Even the tension from earlier felt distant now, replaced by something quieter and more reflective. Then, slowly, the melody shifted once more. It began to build, not suddenly, but gradually, like something growing stronger with purpose. The notes became more confident, more layered, carrying a sense of direction that made people sit up straighter without realizing it. The group at the center table now sat completely silent. No one joked anymore. No one whispered. They simply watched. The leader's expression had changed fully now. The earlier amusement was gone, replaced by something harder to define. It was not anger, not embarrassment alone, but a mix of realization and shock. The situation had moved far beyond what he had expected when he first spoke. The cafe itself felt different now. It no longer felt like a place of routine. It felt like a space holding something rare, something unfolding in real time. And she was still playing. Her movements were steady, but there was emotion behind them now that even she might not have fully understood. It was as if the music was speaking for her in ways she had never allowed herself to speak before. A few more people had now gathered near the edges of the cafe, drawn in by curiosity. They stood quietly, careful not to disturb the moment. Even outside, through the glass windows, passers-by slowed down, sensing something unusual happening inside. Inside, everything continued to center around the piano. The waitress who had once been overlooked by almost everyone in the room was now the only thing anyone could see or hear. And the people who had intended to mock her were no longer laughing. They were listening. The cafe had changed completely, even though nothing on the outside looked different. Tables were still in their places, cups were still on the counter, and the same soft lighting still filled the room. But the atmosphere was no longer ordinary. It felt like time itself had slowed down just to listen. The piano continued to speak in its own language, and she continued to answer it without hesitation. Her fingers moved with a rhythm that now felt natural, as if she had never stopped playing in the first place. The earlier uncertainty had completely disappeared. What remained was something steady, deep, and powerful. Every person in the cafe was now fully aware that something unusual was happening. Even those who had been distracted before were now completely silent. The sound was no longer just background noise. It had become the center of everything. At the center table, the group that had started this situation was no longer relaxed. The confident posture they had entered with had slowly faded. One of them adjusted their position repeatedly, no longer comfortable sitting still. Another kept looking away, then back again, as if trying to understand how things had changed so quickly. But there was no simple answer. The music did not feel like something that could be explained easily. It carried emotion that words could not capture. It felt like a story being told without speaking, one that touched every corner of the room differently. She remained focused, her eyes lowered toward the keys. Her expression was calm, but her mind was fully awake. She was not thinking about the people watching her. She was not thinking about the situation that had brought her here. At this moment, she was only connected to the sound. The piano seemed to respond to her more and more with each passing second. The notes became richer, more layered. It was no longer just a performance. It felt like something flowing through her, not just from her. A quiet tension began to rise again in the room, but this time it was different. It was not the same uncomfortable tension from before. It was anticipation. People did not know where the music was going, but they did not want it to stop. At the edge of the cafe, a few staff members had stopped working completely. One of them stood near the counter, hands resting lightly on a tray, forgotten. Another leaned slightly against a wall, watching without blinking. Even small sounds like plates or footsteps had almost disappeared. The group at the center table tried once again to regain control of their expressions. One of them let out a small laugh, but it did not sound natural anymore. It faded quickly, lost in the music. Another whispered something under their breath, but no one responded, because everyone was listening to something far more powerful than conversation. She shifted slightly on the piano stool, but her playing never stopped. The movement was smooth, controlled. It was clear now that she was not struggling. She was in command of the instrument in a way that surprised even those who had no knowledge of music. The melody changed again. It softened, becoming slower, more emotional. The energy in the room shifted with it. Some people felt a strange calmness, as if the music was pulling them into a different state of mind. Others felt a tightness in their chest, not from discomfort, but from emotion they could not explain. At the center table, the leader of the group leaned forward slightly. His earlier confidence had now completely disappeared. He was no longer trying to joke or dismiss what was happening. He was simply watching. And for the first time since entering the cafe, he was not in control of the moment. The music continued to grow in depth. It was not loud, but it was strong in a way that filled every corner of the room. It carried layers that felt both delicate and powerful at the same time. She did not look at anyone. She did not need to. Her entire focus was on the piano, but something inside her was also changing. As she played, memories she had buried for a long time began to surface in small fragments. Not painful but distant, like pieces of a life she had once known but left behind. She remembered quieter moments from long ago, sitting near a piano that once felt like a friend. She remembered how natural it used to feel, how easy it was to lose herself in sound. She had not realized how deeply that part of her still existed until this very moment. The cafe felt smaller now, not physically, but emotionally. Everything was drawn toward the piano. Even people who had not planned to stay were now unable to leave. Some stood near the entrance, watching from a distance, as if afraid to interrupt something important. The group at the center table now looked fully unsettled. The earlier sense of superiority they had carried was gone. One of them glanced at others in the group, as if silently asking what to do, but no one had an answer, because there was nothing they could do. The situation was no longer about control or intention. It had become something they were all witnessing, something they were all part of whether they wanted to be or not. The waitress continued to play. Her hands moved faster now, but still with precision. The music rose again, stronger this time. It was no longer just emotional. It carried intensity, like a wave building slowly before reaching its peak. The room reacted without speaking. Some people leaned slightly forward. Others held their breath without realizing it. The air felt charged, as if something important was about to happen. At the center table, one of the guests finally lowered their gaze. The confidence had fully disappeared from their expression. Another kept staring at the piano, unable to look away, and still she played on. The melody reached a point where it felt almost overwhelming, but not chaotic. It was controlled, shaped carefully by her hands. Every note had purpose. Every pause had meaning. The cafe no longer felt like a cafe. It felt like a space held together by sound alone. Even outside, people walking past slowed down. Some stopped at the windows, looking in with curiosity. They could not hear every detail clearly from outside, but they could sense something powerful happening within. Inside, no one moved. She reached a point in the music where the emotion became stronger than before. It was not sadness or joy alone. It was something in between, something that reflected a deeper part of human experience. Her posture remained steady, but there was a slight change in the way she held herself. It was subtle, but it showed that she was completely immersed in what she was doing. The group at the center table now sat completely silent. There were no more jokes, no more attempts at control. Just silence and attention, because what they were hearing could not be dismissed anymore. It was not just a performance. It was something far greater than that. The cafe was now completely silent except for the piano. Even the smallest sounds that normally filled the space during a busy day seemed to have disappeared. No cups clinking, no soft conversations, no footsteps moving quickly across the floor. It was as if the entire place had been paused, waiting for her next note. She continued to play with a calm focus that surprised even her. There was no hesitation anymore. Her fingers moved smoothly across the keys, as if they had always known where to go. The music no longer felt like something she was trying to remember. It felt like something she was finally allowed to express. The group at the center table sat frozen in their seats. The earlier expressions of amusement and confidence were gone. Now there was only silence and attention. One of them rested their hands on the table, but even that small movement felt uncertain, like they were no longer sure how to behave in this moment. Another person from the group glanced around the cafe, as if expecting someone to interrupt or change the situation. But no one did. Everyone was focused on the same thing. The piano. She remained unaware of their shifting emotions. Her attention was completely inside the music. The notes were no longer just sounds. They felt like pieces of a story unfolding in real time. Each one carried weight, each one connected to the next. As she played, something inside her began to feel lighter. It was not sudden. It was slow and quiet, like a door opening that had been closed for a long time. She did not fully understand it, but she could feel it happening. The cafe manager stood near the counter watching carefully. At first, there had been concern when the situation began. It had looked like something uncomfortable might happen. But now that concern had turned into something else entirely. It was a kind of respect mixed with disbelief. The staff members who were supposed to be working had stopped completely. One of them held a tray without remembering why. Another stood near a table, looking toward the piano with an expression that was hard to describe. It was not just surprise. It was something closer to awe. Even customers who had entered the cafe earlier for a quick meal were now sitting longer than they planned. No one wanted to leave. No one wanted to miss what was happening. The group at the center table tried once again to adjust their behavior. One of them leaned back slightly, trying to regain a sense of control, but it did not work. The situation was no longer under anyone's control except hers. The music changed again. It softened for a moment, almost like a breath being taken after a long sentence. The room seemed to relax with it. Then slowly it began to build again. Not suddenly, but carefully, like something growing stronger step by step. She felt it too. Her hands responded naturally, without effort. The piano felt familiar now, as if it had been waiting for her return. The connection between her and the instrument had become deeper with every passing second. At the center table, the leader of the group shifted slightly in his seat. His expression was no longer mocking or relaxed. It had changed into something more serious. He was no longer trying to find humor in the situation. He was trying to understand it. But understanding was not easy. What he was hearing was not just skill. It was emotion shaped into sound. It carried depth that could not be measured in words. It made people feel something without explaining why. The cafe felt different now. Even the air seemed still. People were no longer just watching. They were experiencing something together, even if they did not speak to each other. She continued playing. Her posture remained steady, but there was a subtle change in her presence. She no longer looked like someone working in a cafe. She looked like someone fully connected to something larger than the room itself. The music grew slightly stronger again, filling the space with emotion. It was not loud, but it was powerful. It moved through the room like waves, reaching every corner, every person, every thought. At one point, a customer near the window slowly placed a hand over their chest without realizing it. Another closed their eyes for a moment, as if trying to hold onto the feeling the music created. The group at the center table was no longer speaking at all. Even their earlier small reactions had stopped. Now they were simply watching, listening, and realizing that what they had expected was completely wrong. The leader's gaze remained fixed on her hands. He could not look away. Something about the way she played made it impossible to treat the moment lightly anymore. It was not about her position or appearance. It was not about assumptions or expectations. It was about something deeper that could not be ignored. She reached a section of the music that felt more intense. Her fingers moved slightly faster, but still controlled. The sound filled the cafe completely now, wrapping around every silence. People were no longer just listening. They were feeling. The cafe manager slowly stepped a little closer, stopping near the side of the room. There was no intention to interrupt. It was simply impossible to ignore what was happening. Even the staff who usually worked quickly and efficiently were now standing still. No one gave instructions. No one needed to. The music was enough. At the center table, one of the guests finally lowered their head slightly. It was not a dramatic reaction. It was quiet, almost unnoticed by others. But it showed something important had changed inside them. The earlier idea of entertainment had disappeared completely. What remained was realization. She continued to play without stopping. Her face remained calm, but there was something different in her expression now. It was not pride. It was not excitement. It was something closer to release. As if she was no longer holding back a part of herself she had hidden for a long time. The piano responded to her like it was part of her own breathing. The cafe was now fully transformed by sound. Every person inside was connected to the same moment, whether they understood it or not. The group that had once tried to control the situation now sat completely still, unable to change what they were witnessing. And she, seated at the piano, continued to play as if she had only just begun. See. The music inside the cafe had now taken full control of the moment. It was no longer something happening in the background. It was the only thing that seemed to exist. Every person inside the room was connected to it in their own quiet way, even if they did not fully understand why. She continued to play with steady hands, her focus deep and unbroken. The piano keys responded to her touch like they had become part of her own thoughts. There was no hesitation in her movements now. Everything flowed naturally, as if the music had already been written inside her long ago and was only now being released. The earlier tension from the center table had completely faded. The group that had entered the cafe with confidence and pride now sat in silence. No one was laughing anymore. No one was making comments. They were simply watching, listening, and slowly realizing that what they had intended was no longer relevant. The leader of the group shifted slightly in his seat again. His expression had changed completely from what it had been earlier. There was no amusement left in his face. Instead, there was something heavier, a kind of quiet realization that was difficult to hide. He had expected something very different when he first spoke. He had expected hesitation, maybe discomfort, or even failure. But what he was seeing and hearing now did not fit any of those expectations. The music rose again. Not suddenly, but slowly, like a wave building in the distance before reaching the shore. It filled the cafe with a deeper emotional layer that made it impossible to ignore. Some people felt a strange warmth in their chest. Others simply sat still, unable to move or speak. She felt it too. Her hands moved with increasing confidence, but her mind was not focused on control anymore. It was focused on expression. Every note carried something from within her that had been quiet for a long time, something she had not shared with anyone. The cafe itself seemed different now. Even the light felt softer. Even the silence between notes felt meaningful. It was as if the space had become part of the performance. At the center table, one of the guests slowly leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table. It was not an act of superiority anymore. It was attention. Real attention. The kind that comes when something unexpected forces a person to stop thinking and start feeling. Another guest looked down briefly, as if trying to process what was happening inside their own thoughts. The earlier idea of mockery no longer existed in that space. It had been replaced by something they did not have words for. The waitress continued to play. Her posture remained calm, but there was a subtle shift in her presence. It was no longer just about skill. There was emotion in every movement, something honest and unfiltered. It made the music feel alive in a way that could not be easily described. A few customers near the window were now fully turned toward the piano. One of them had stopped eating completely. Another had placed their phone aside without noticing it. The world outside the cafe no longer seemed important. Inside, everything was centered around her. The music softened again for a moment. It felt like a pause, a gentle breath in the middle of something larger. The room seemed to relax with it, as if everyone had been holding on to something without realizing it. Then it changed again. This time it became stronger, more layered. Not loud but deep. It carried emotion that felt both heavy and light at the same time. It moved through the room like a quiet force that could not be stopped. She was no longer thinking about anything outside the piano. Her entire attention was inside the sound. The keys felt familiar now, like they had always belonged to her hands. At the center table, the leader of the group slowly lowered his gaze for a moment. It was not out of disrespect. It was as if he needed a second to process what he was feeling. When he looked back up, his expression had changed again. There was no more confidence left in the way he carried himself. No more attempt to control the moment. Just silence and reflection. The cafe manager, standing a little further back, remained still. There was no interruption, no instruction. It was clear that nothing needed to be done. The moment was already complete on its own. The staff members who had been moving quickly earlier in the day were now fully still. Even their usual sense of urgency had disappeared. Everyone was listening. The music continued. It reached another rise, not sudden, but carefully built. It felt like a story reaching a turning point, where everything that came before was leading to this exact moment. She did not look at the audience. She did not need to. Her connection to the piano was enough. At the center table, one of the guests finally rested back in their chair, their expression no longer tense but thoughtful. It was as if something inside them had shifted quietly. Another guest glanced toward the piano and then away again, unable to hold the intensity of the moment for too long. But they kept listening, because even if they wanted to look away, they could not ignore the sound. The cafe had become a different place entirely. It was no longer just a cafe with customers and staff. It had become a space where something unexpected was unfolding in real time, and she was at the center of it. Her hands moved faster for a brief moment, then slowed again. The rhythm was carefully controlled, but deeply emotional. Every note felt intentional. There was no performance for approval. There was only expression. The group that had once tried to make her play for their amusement now sat in complete silence. Their earlier intentions no longer mattered. What remained was awareness. Awareness that they had misjudged the moment completely. The music softened again toward the end of this section. It did not stop, but it felt like it was preparing for something larger ahead. A quiet transition, like a breath before the next movement. She continued playing, her face calm, her focus complete. And in that moment, the entire cafe remained still, held together by the sound that had changed everything without a single word being spoken. The cafe was no longer just a place where people came to eat or drink. It had turned into something else entirely, something quieter and more powerful. The music had filled every corner of the room for so long that even after each note faded, it felt like the sound was still there, hanging in the air. She continued to play, but now the energy in her performance was different. The intensity had softened into something more controlled, more reflective. It was as if the music was slowly coming down from a peak, not ending suddenly, but gently guiding everyone toward a closing moment. Her fingers moved with calm precision. There was no rush anymore, no pressure, just flow. Each note felt carefully placed, like part of a final message that did not need words. Around her, the cafe remained silent. Even the group that had once created this situation sat without speaking. The earlier confidence they had carried into the room was gone completely. No one was trying to joke, no one was trying to distract themselves. They were simply watching and listening. The leader of the group looked different now. His posture was no longer relaxed or dominant. It was quieter, almost uncertain. He kept his eyes on the piano, but not in the same way as before. Earlier, he had watched with expectation. Now he watched with realization. It was clear that something had changed in him during the performance. Not something visible on the outside at first, but something internal that had slowly shifted while the music played. She, however, remained unaware of most of their reactions. Her focus was still on the piano. For her, the world had narrowed into sound and movement. Everything else had faded into the background. The music softened further. It felt like it was reaching its final shape, not disappearing, but becoming more peaceful. The energy in the room followed it. People who had been sitting tense earlier now leaned back slightly. Some exhaled slowly without realizing they had been holding their breath. Even the staff who had been standing still began to move slightly again, but very carefully, as if they did not want to break the moment too quickly. The cafe manager remained near the side, watching quietly. There was no need for instructions. No one needed to be told to behave or stay silent. The moment had created its own discipline. At the center table, one of the guests finally lowered their gaze to the table. It was not out of boredom or disinterest. Felt more like reflection. Something in what they had just witnessed had stayed with them in a way that was difficult to ignore. Another guest slowly adjusted their posture, sitting more upright now, as if trying to understand what they had just experienced. The music continued gently. She played the final section with care. Every note felt lighter now, but still meaningful. There was a sense of closure forming in the sound. Not an ending that felt abrupt, but one that felt complete. Her expression remained calm. There was no dramatic change in her face. No visible emotion of pride or shock. Instead, there was a quiet focus, as if she was simply finishing something she had known how to do all along. And then, slowly, the final notes arrived. They were soft, deliberate. They filled the room and then began to fade naturally, like ripples disappearing on still water. She let the last note linger for a moment. Then she lifted her hands away from the keys. Silence followed immediately. It was not the same silence that had existed before the performance. This one felt heavier, deeper, as if the room needed time to understand that the music had truly stopped. No one spoke. No one moved at first. The cafe was still. She remained seated for a moment, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She did not look around. She did not search for reactions. It was as if she already knew that what had just happened did not need approval. Behind her, the group at the center table sat frozen in place for a few seconds longer. Then, slowly, something shifted. The leader of the group leaned back slightly, his expression no longer sharp or dismissive. It was quiet now, thoughtful. He looked toward the piano again, but this time without any expectation. One of the guests beside him glanced at the others in the group, but no one said anything. There was nothing to say that would properly explain what they had just experienced, because what they had witnessed was not simple entertainment. It was something deeper, something that had challenged the way they had looked at the situation from the beginning. The waitress slowly stood up from the piano stool. Her movements were calm and natural. There was no hesitation in her actions. She adjusted her uniform lightly, as if returning to something familiar. She did not rush. She did not try to leave quickly. She simply turned slightly away from the piano, as if acknowledging it one last time before stepping back into her role. Around her, the cafe began to return to small movements again. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone quietly picked up a cup. Another person whispered something softly to the person next to them, but even those whispers felt different now. Quieter, more respectful. The manager finally exhaled slowly, as if realizing that the moment had passed. But no one went back to normal immediately, because something had changed. The group at the center table slowly gathered themselves. One of them looked down at the table again, then toward the piano, then away. It was as if they were still trying to understand how their expectations had completely shifted. The leader finally spoke a few quiet words to the others, but it was not loud enough to carry across the room. Whatever was said did not feel important compared to what had just happened. The waitress stepped away from the piano and moved back toward her work area. Her steps were steady, simple, familiar again. But something about her felt different now. It was not visible in a dramatic way. It was subtle. A quiet change that others could sense but not fully explain. The same person who had been serving tables earlier now carried a presence that was impossible to ignore. As she reached the counter, she picked up a tray again. The normal sounds of the cafe slowly returned. Plates, footsteps, low conversations. But everything felt softer than before. Even the people who had not been part of the performance seemed affected in some way. They spoke a little less loudly. They moved a little more carefully. The group at the center table finally began preparing to leave. There was no more confidence in their movements, no more sense of superiority. They left the table quietly, one by one. As they passed by the piano, they did not look at it the same way anymore. It was no longer just furniture in a cafe. It was something that had revealed a truth they had not expected. The waitress continued her work as if nothing had changed. But the cafe itself had changed. And even though the day would continue, and new customers would come and go, the memory of what had happened in that moment would remain in every person who had been there.